Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanasha Karanam Bhaveshwaram Svikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Swami Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning we'll continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last time. So we're on a beautiful chapter called The Last Visit to Keshav. And we're on page 321 near the top. And this was November 28th, 1883. So Sri Ramakrishna had gone to see Keshav, who was in his last illness. This was the last time he saw Keshav, the leader of the Brahmo Samaj and the leader of the branch of the Brahmo Samaj called Navavidhan, the new dispensation, which was deeply influenced by Sri Ramakrishna, because Keshav himself had been deeply influenced by Sri Ramakrishna. And it can be said that of all of the devotees of the Brahmo Samaj, it was Keshav with whom Sri Ramakrishna was closest. There were others like Bijoy Krishna Goswami that were very close to Sri Ramakrishna and that Sri Ramakrishna loved very much and influenced very deeply. But of all of them, Keshav was the one with whom Sri Ramakrishna had the deepest relationship. And it was Sri Ramakrishna that molded Keshav's spiritual life and really directed him to deeper spiritual life. Whereas before, Keshav had been a leader of the Brahmo Samaj, but had been more involved in philanthropic activities, service, social reform, and a sort of superficial religion. But Sri Ramakrishna saw in him on first meeting the depth of Keshav and the potential of Keshav. And it certainly was part of the Divine Mother's play, part of her plan, part of her will, that Sri Ramakrishna came to Keshav, because it was through Keshav that Sri Ramakrishna became known, and it was through that that the young disciples that were to carry on Sri Ramakrishna's message started coming to him. It was after Keshav had been deeply influenced and had begun writing about Sri Ramakrishna, quoting him, and had begun to promote spiritual practice, which had been absent in the Brahmo Samaj prior to Sri Ramakrishna's meeting. That the young people of Calcutta, some of them became interested themselves, and thus the future disciples of Sri Ramakrishna came to him. So on this day, when Sri Ramakrishna had gone to see Keshav, who was very, very ill, Sri Ramakrishna went into ecstasy when Keshav came in. And then in a state of ecstasy, he began to talk. And so what we read last time was both the setup for the coming of Sri Ramakrishna to Keshav, Keshav's coming out to see Sri Ramakrishna going into ecstasy, and then beginning to talk in a state of ecstasy. So there were a number of paragraphs where Sri Ramakrishna had already been speaking in a state of ecstasy, and that continues here. And the immediate context for what we're reading now was that Sri Ramakrishna was talking about Shakti, the divine power, the divine mother. So through Sri Ramakrishna's influence, Keshav himself became a devotee of the Divine Mother, and the Brahmo Samaj itself became oriented towards the idea of God as mother. So Sri Ramakrishna continues saying, if you are aware of the male principle, that is the divine male principle, you cannot ignore the female principle. He who is aware of the father must also think of the mother. Keshav laughs. He who knows darkness also knows light. He who knows night also knows day. He who knows happiness also knows misery. You understand this, don't you? Keshav, yes, sir, I do. So here, first of all, Sri Ramakrishna says that you cannot, if you are aware of the male principle, you will be aware of the female principle also. So this refers to the tradition in Indian religious thought of identifying the absolute Brahman, which in truth is neuter. It has no gender. It's beyond all ideas of duality, all of the polar opposites, all concepts, everything. Nothing can be said of it or spoken of it that it doesn't misrepresent it. But it is most often represented as Shiva. Shiva, of the many Hindu gods, actually, they're not 33 million Hindu gods or 330 million, or 33 Koti gods would be 330 million gods. There's nothing like that in Hinduism. There are many village gods and goddesses, which are minor deities, and they're the Vedic deities who are minor deities. But the main deities who are worshipped are a handful. But of them, well, let me finish that thought first. The 33 Koti is often thought to mean, Koti has the meaning in Sanskrit of 10 million. And so 33 Koti means 330 million. But Koti also means class. So it could mean 33 classes of deities. And so that's probably what the 33 Koti devatas refers to, 33 classes of deities. But again, that's including all of the village deities and the minor deities and so forth, which are more like angels in the Abrahamic tradition. So of the major deities who are God, the personal God, the Lord of the universe, the one who most represents Brahman is Shiva. Vishnu also, of course, is God, fully God, and therefore represents Brahman also. But Shiva is the one who most represents the transcendent itself. And so Shiva being a male deity, and Shiva being the representation in anthropomorphic form, in the form of a deity of the absolute, The absolute is thought of in male terms oftentimes, though again, in reality, it's beyond all gender. And the creative power is thought of as Shakti, the Divine Mother. The divine Shakti means power, energy, and so the divine power, the creative power of the Absolute is the Divine Mother. So when he speaks of the male and female principle, the male principle refers to Brahman, the Absolute, and the female principle refers to the Divine Mother, who is the creative power out of which this universe has come. And so if you are aware of the male principle, you cannot ignore the female principle that Sri Ramakrishna often taught, that you can't think of the Absolute without thinking of the relative. You can't think of Brahman without thinking of Shakti. And so that's the same as you can't think of the male principle without thinking of the female principle. He who is aware of the father must also think of the mother, and Keshav laughs. So when reading the English gospel, we often wonder when it says all laugh or here Keshav laughs, what was the joke? There's no joke here. Well, no, here in some cases, it's because the humor doesn't translate into English. But here, it's not that the humor of the Bengali doesn't translate. In Bengali, it would read the same, that if you can't think of the father without thinking of the mother. We have to understand from this, the fact that Keshav laughs means that Sri Ramakrishna told it in a humorous way. We all know people who everything they say comes out funny. Because they are so good at telling jokes and so forth, that everything they say comes out funny. And so Sri Ramakrishna was such an entertaining speaker and had such an ability to convey emotion and bhava, state of mind, the context of the thinking and so forth, that if he wanted, he could make anything humorous. And so here we have to understand that. The Keshav laughs not because the simple statement is funny in itself. No, it's not a joke. But Sri Ramakrishna must have said it in a way that conveyed delight. And so Keshav laughs not because, he just told a joke, but because of the delight Sri Ramakrishna conveyed. He continues, he who knows darkness also knows light. He who knows night also knows day. He who knows happiness also knows misery. You understand this, don't you? And again, Keshav replies, yes, sir, I do. So again, the idea that Sri Ramakrishna is giving here is that when you have two poles, you can't think of one without the other. Like negative and positive. You can't think of the negative pole of a battery without thinking of the positive pole of the battery also. And so in this universe, Sri Ramakrishna always insisted that there are all these polar opposites, and one includes the other, even at the level of the divine, where there's the absolute and the relative. If you think of the absolute, you think of the relative. And if you think of the relative, you have to think of the absolute. In fact, I won't develop that here because that would take us far from the text. But Swami Vivekananda gives that as one of the arguments for the existence of God. That if you have imperfection, you automatically have perfection. If you have relative existence, you have the absolute. If you have the ever-changing universe, Buddha said that sarvam kshanikam kshanikam, everything is changing every moment. So Swamiji says, if you have the idea of change, it automatically gives the idea of the changeless as well, which is one of the core definitions of God, that which doesn't change. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna is referring to here, and Keshav says, yes, I understand it. So again, this also is important, because when Keshav says that, yes, sir, I do, Keshav, it shows how much Keshav had grown in his understanding. And that understanding had grown because he had grown in experience as well. Under Sri Ramakrishna's influence, he had begun to practice a great deal of spiritual practice. He had begun to spend much of his time in meditation, prayer and meditation. He would sometimes wear the Gerawa cloth and would shave his head and so forth. And so his whole life had gone through a complete transformation where before Keshav had rejected much of Hinduism. In fact, the Brahmo Samaj had separated itself from Hinduism and considered itself a reform movement which was different from Hinduism. It took some ideas from Hinduism, a few prayers from the Vedas and so forth, but it considered itself non-Hindu and looked on Hinduism as a system of retrogressive superstition. But through Sri Ramakrishna's influence, he had come to see the great depth of Hinduism, had come to appreciate the depth of the scriptures and the tradition and the practices, and had begun to incorporate those. And so when he says, "Yes, sir, I do understand," that is an indication of all that had gone on in Keshav's life. The master continues, "My mother, who is my mother? Ah, she is the mother of the universe. It is she who creates and preserves the world, who always protects her children, and who grants whatever they desire, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. That is, the four traditional goals of human life, the purusharthas, the four values of human life, or goals of human life. That is, dharma, righteousness, artha, possession, kama, sense delight, sense fulfillment, the fulfillment of desires, and moksha, liberation, spiritual liberation. So these are the four things that people seek. And so it is the Divine Mother who grants those. He continues, "A true son cannot live away from his mother. The mother knows everything. The child only eats, drinks, and makes merry. He doesn't worry himself about the things of the world." So how true that is. And Sri Ramakrishna is presenting that as the idea of the spiritual aspirant who looks on God as mother. Just as the child doesn't worry about anything, my mother is there. She will take care of things. I don't have to wonder where the food is coming from for today. I don't have to worry about what I'm going to cook today to feed people. I don't have to worry about going to work to make money. I don't have to worry about anything. My mother will take care of everything. So I'm free to play. And so that is the attitude that comes to a person who takes up long enough and deeply enough the idea that God is my mother. And mother will take care of everything. The difference, of course, between the child and the spiritual aspirant who takes up this idea is that the child knows its mother will take care of everything because the child has no responsibilities in the world and not responsible for anything. The spiritual aspirant who takes up that attitude may have a family, may have a job, may be running an ashram, may have various other things to do, responsibilities, but has the same attitude there. So the child, as the child grows up and begins to take on responsibilities, then they become burdened by those responsibilities. The child's carefree attitude is dependent on not having anything really that they have to do. Nothing is expected of the child. But the spiritual aspirant is a person who is mature inwardly and outwardly, but who has that same carefree attitude. So it's a very different thing. I remember as a child thinking how I didn't want to grow up because I saw how burdened adults were with concerns and worries about things. And I said, I don't want any of that. But of course, I had to grow up. I didn't have any choice about it. And I remember the time when a friend of mine in high school, I would have been in the 10th grade at that time, a friend of mine in high school told me that he had a job at a grocery store. And one asked if I wanted to work with him. He said, it's really nice. The people I work for are really great in this small neighborhood grocery. And I get pocket money, and the work's not hard, and so you could get a job there too. So I thought, sure, I'll get a job. I went and lasted one day because suddenly I realized that No, now I've got to do this. It's not play, it's not playing store or anything, but I've got to do it. And if I make a mistake, I get scolded. It's not worth it. I get my allowance from my. Why do I need extra pocket money? So I gave it up because it was real responsibility. But the person who has deeply enough imbibed this idea that God is my mother and has learned to depend on God, then they once again become carefree. And I saw that in the disciples of Holy Mother, that they knew that Holy Mother was their mother, their divine mother, and that they had nothing in the world to worry about. So many of them had big responsibilities and many problems that came with the responsibilities. And yet they were carefree because they knew that Mother is there, she'll take care of everything. All they needed to do was just to meet to the circumstances as they arose, but no worry about what's going to happen in the future, what is going to happen with this, what is going to happen with that, where's the money going to come from, where are the people going to come from, and all of that. No, Mother is taking care of everything. I just meet the circumstances as they arise, as Mother gives them to me. So the child only eats, drinks, and makes merry. He doesn't worry himself about the things of the world. So that I saw in these great disciples. Keshav, yes, sir, it is quite true. While talking, Sri Ramakrishna regained normal consciousness of the world. With a smile on his face, he conversed with Keshav. The room full of men watched them eagerly and listened to their words. Everybody was amazed to find that neither Keshav nor the master inquired about each other's health. They talked only of God. So again, Sri Ramakrishna had begun the conversation in a state of ecstasy and began speaking in a state of ecstasy. And gradually, as he spoke, his mind came back to awareness of the external world and the circumstances and everything else, what was going on in the room around him and all of that. But that took time as he spoke for that to happen. And so it says that the room full of men watched eagerly. And that's because in those days in India, the women would have been separate. They would have been behind a screen where the men couldn't see them, listening but not participating. But the men would have been, it would have been only men gathered in the room. And so they were so absorbed in talking of spiritual things that neither of them asked how the other was. Though, as we go forward, Sri Ramakrishna will begin to speak to Keshav about his physical state. Master to Keshav, why do the members of the Brahmo Samaj dwell so much on God's glories? Is there any great need of repeating such things as, O God, thou hast created the moon, the sun, and the stars? Most people are filled with admiration for the garden only. How few care to see its owner. Who is greater, the garden or its owner? So this was something Sri Ramakrishna would often say. And it was something that he had learned about the Brahmos from an early time. And because before meeting Keshav Chandra Sen, Sri Ramakrishna knew almost nothing about the British. He had grown up and lived his life with no influence of the growing English domination of Hindu society. Mathur Babu was the first person Sri Ramakrishna met who had grown up or who had been educated in the British system. But just seeing one person in Mathur for Sri Ramakrishna, that was an anomaly. Mathur was just one person who had the influence of British ideas. And so it was not enough to see what was happening to India through British education. And Mathur also, under the influence of Sri Ramakrishna, he quickly began to change. And so he didn't remain as he had been for long under Sri Ramakrishna, under his devotion to Sri Ramakrishna. So it was with Keshav and the Brahmo Samaj that Sri Ramakrishna began to realize how deeply the English thinking was, or Western thinking, was infiltrating the Indian mind through education. And of course, that was a deliberate policy of the English. They were quite conscious of the fact that if we can educate the people of this country in the English way, then they will lose all of their superstitions, and then they will become like Europeans. And then they will be a much more useful part of the empire to us if we can get them to give up their own culture, educate them in Western culture. And so it was a deliberate and conscious part of the English system in India to educate useful civil servants, useful to the British Empire, civil servants who would give up their old culture and adhere to the British way of thinking and doing. And that was amazingly successful, amazingly successful. There's something aggressive, and I don't mean just militarily aggressive, though that is there, but that's not what I'm speaking of now. There's something aggressive about Western culture, which you can see how Western culture has spread around the world and influenced cultures everywhere. Part of it was through colonialism, but even after the colonial period ended, cultural colonialism has continued, and the domination of the world by Western culture is quite an amazing thing. The British have been replaced by American culture, and so American culture has spread around the world. It would be, and I'm sure there are people who have been studying it, but it would be an interesting study to analyze the why Western and more recently American culture in particular has been so aggressively successful. Because American culture has even influenced in time England and Europe. So, but Sri Ramakrishna noticed that with the coming of the Brahmo Samaj into his acquaintance. And so, so here he says, why do the members of the Brahmo Samaj dwell so much on God's glories? So that was because of the influence of Christianity, through the British, the influence of Christianity on the Brahmo Samaj. I remember as a child, the hymns we used to sing in church, one of them, for the beauty of the earth, for the beauty of the skies, for the beauty of the, I forget what the rest of it is. But both in song, hymns, and in prayers and so forth, praising God for the beauties of this world and for all of the good things that God has given us in this world and all of that. So Sri Ramakrishna used to criticize that. You don't find that in traditional Hindu poetry and hymns. But it came to the Brahmos through Christianity. Is there any great need, he says, of repeating such things as God, thou hast created the moon, the sun, and the stars? So Sri Ramakrishna's idea was that one should approach God, that the solution of life's problems, our ignorance, our weakness, our fallibility, etc., comes through going to God. So the goal of the Hindu religion is to find God, not to celebrate the beauty of everything here. Yes, there is certainly in India, as anywhere else, in the Hindu mind as anywhere else, there is an appreciation of beauty. But there's a wonderful story of told by Swami Guru Das Maharaj. I forget his Swami name, a great American saint of the order. He was a man of deep spiritual experience who lived the last 50-something years of his life in India. He was going to Kedar Badri with Swami Turiyananda. And in those days, even now to go to Kedar, you have to walk a long ways to get there. But in his day, you had to walk for a long way, for almost from the plains up to Kedar. And so he and the party of pilgrims were making their ascent, getting higher and higher in the Himalayas, when they made a turn around the mountain path and saw the hillside covered with the wildflowers. And it was such an extraordinarily beautiful sight with the snow peaks above and the beautiful rock formations, the river down below, and the hillside covered with wildflowers, that everyone gasped when they saw the hillside. But what did they do next? All of the pilgrims sat down there itself and closed their eyes and began to meditate. The idea being, and then the spontaneous idea, nobody said, okay, now let's all sit down and meditate. It's just what people did. The idea of seeing physical beauty reminds one of the source of all beauty, which is God. And so they sat to meditate. They didn't turn around and say, wow, look at those flowers. Aren't those beautiful? Have you ever seen such pretty flowers? Wow, I really like this. I'm going to take a picture and take it home and show my friends. You remember that time when we were in such and such a place and we saw flowers there too? That was so beautiful. And on and on and on, externalizing the experience. No, they saw beauty. They stopped, sat quiet, closed their eyes, and meditated on the divine. And so Sri Ramakrishna, again, he is telling Keshav that there's no need. Swami Atmarupananda, yes. So Guru Das Maharaj was Swami Atmarupananda. So why do the members of the Brahmo Samaj dwell so much on God's glories? That's the idea behind his criticism. And then he continues, after a few drinks at a tavern, do I care to know how many gallons of wine are stored there? One bottle is enough for me. So that is that if I absorb my mind in God, I don't care to know about all of God's glories. I'm drunk, as it were, on the being of God itself. That's enough for me. Then he continues, when I met Narendra, I never asked him, who is your father? How many houses does he have? So, of course, Keshav knew Narendra. Narendra at this time was not at all famous. He was just a school boy or young man. He wasn't a boy anymore, young man, but just a student without any fame. But because he was a regular at the Brahmo Samaj and used to attend both Keshav's Brahmo Samaj as well as the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, so he was known in the group. So Sri Ramakrishna refers to him. And Keshav also had come to know that Sri Ramakrishna was extraordinarily fond of this young man. And so Sri Ramakrishna is using Narendra as an example, a known example to Keshav, that when he sees Narendra, he's so fond of Narendra himself that what does it matter how many houses his father has and where he lives and all of that? No, it's the person himself that he loves. Shall I tell you the truth? Man loves his own riches, and so he thinks that God loves his too. He thinks that God will be pleased if we glorify his riches. Once Shambhu, that is Shambhu Malik, said to me, please bless me that I may die leaving my riches at the lotus feet of God. I answered, these are riches only to you. What riches can you offer God? To him, these are mere dust and straw. So sometimes Sri Ramakrishna seems harsh, like here. Shambhu Malik is making a devout wish that I want to, when I die, I want to give all of my wealth to God as an offering. But Sri Ramakrishna is reminding him, and through this story, he's telling Keshav that all wealth is just dust and straw to God. So praising God, oh, what a beautiful moon you have made, what a beautiful forest you've made, what beautiful oceans you have made, and all of this. That's like praising a person, oh, your jewelry is so beautiful, your dress is so beautiful, you've done your hair so nicely and everything. That an ordinary person, being vain, is pleased. But to God, all of that is nothing. God's being is the source of all beauty, the source of all existence, the source of all knowledge. What are these things worth praising to God, the source of all reality itself? Once a thief broke into the temple of Vishnu, that is at Dakshineshwar, and robbed the image of its jewels. Mathur Babu and I went to the temple to see what was the matter. Addressing the image, Mathur said bitterly, "What a shame, Lord, you are so worthless. The thief took all the ornaments from your body and you couldn't do a thing about it." Thereupon I said to Mathur, "Shame on you. How improper your words are. To God, the jewels you talk so much about are only lumps of clay. Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune, is his consort. Do you mean to say that he should spend sleepless nights because a thief has taken your few rupees? You mustn't say such things." So again, all of this is for Keshav's sake. That Sri Ramakrishna is inspiring him with renunciation because he knows that Keshav only has a very short time to live. He's practically on his deathbed now. And so he's inspiring in him the final renunciation, that the wealth of this world, all of the glories of this world, those are nothing. Go to God himself. That's where reality is. That's where value is. These things are nothing. And so as he says here that Mathur Babu, when the thief had stolen the jewels from the image, Mathur Babu criticizes God and says, "You can't even take care of your own jewels. What a shame! You're useless." That's because these things were big deals to Mathur. He and the Rani had spent money to buy beautiful jewelry to adorn the image with. But the God accepts these things as offerings from us because we need to offer them. They mean nothing to God. Sri Krishna says in the Gita, "Patram pushpam phalam toyam." Whatever you offer to me, whether it's a leaf, a flower, a little pure water, whatever you offer to me, that I accept, the offering of my devotee. So that's the graciousness of God. That's not because God needs a leaf or a flower or some water. It's because whatever we offer, God accepts. And so the jewelry that was offered, that was for our sake. That's valuable to us. It has no value to God. There's the example of Swami Dayananda Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj, whom Sri Ramakrishna met on one occasion during his period of sadhana. So Dayananda, when I believe he was a boy of 12, the Shivaratri was being performed, and there was the image of Shiva, the Shiva Lingam, and a rat came in and stole some of the prasad that was to be offered to the Shiva Lingam. So in that moment, he realized that, well, what's the use of image worship? The image can't even protect its own food. And so he gave up the idea of image worship, and he, in time, started the reform movement. There was the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal, but Swami Dayananda Saraswati started the Arya Samaj, which is a different type of reform movement. But it also criticized image worship, deity worship, and all of that. I tried to find a purified form of Hinduism like the Brahmo Samaj tried to do. But the same applies to that. What does Shiva care about the prasad offerings? Is Shiva, the deity, sitting there in the form of the linga feeling hungry? That he has to get up and chase the rat away to to protect the food? No, that's for us. The worship is for our sake, not for God's sake. What does God care if a luchi or a puri or a chapati is stolen from the plate of food being offered to him? It means nothing to him. So that's no proof that image worship is useless. So he continues, "Can one ever bring God under control through wealth? He can be tamed only through love. What does he want? Certainly not wealth. He wants from his devotees love, devotion, feeling, discrimination, and renunciation." So we should never think that by giving wealth to God that we're going to control God. I'm going to give these jewels to the image, and so God will certainly do what I want him to do. I'm going to give this money to the temple, and so certainly God is going to do what I want him to do. No, that's a blessing for us to be able to give to God or to a temple or whatever, or to a sacred cause. it has no effect over controlling God. It's a blessing for us that we get to give something. He continues, one looks on God exactly according to one's own inner feeling. Take, for instance, a devotee with an excess of tamas. He thinks that the Divine Mother eats goat, so he slaughters one for her. Again, the devotee endowed with rajas cooks rice and various other dishes for the mother. But the sattvic devotee doesn't make any outer show of his worship. People don't even know that he is worshiping. If he has no flowers, he worships God with mere Ganges water and the leaves of the bel tree. His food offering to the deity consists of sweetened puffed rice or a few candies. Occasionally, he cooks a little rice pudding for the deity. So here he talks about the different types of worship. The tamasic person who likes meat, they think the deity likes meat, so they sacrifice a goat and offer the goat to Mother Kali. The Rajasic devotee likes fine food and lots of dishes and so forth. So they cook rice and all kinds of different preparations and offer that to the deity because that's what they like. The sattvic devotee, the pure-hearted devotee, gives simple offerings. He says sweetened puffed rice, that is muri, as it's called in Bengali, or puffed rice, which is sweetened with sugar and sometimes coconut and other things. Or maybe just some payasam, that is the rice pudding, which he says here means payasam or kheer. That's enough for the pure devotee to offer to God, because again, the offering is a vehicle of devotion. So that doesn't mean one should offer only simple things because I don't want to spend money. No, the idea is not, I'll be a sattvic devotee because then I don't have to spend so much money. I can just get away with doing something simple. No, the idea is that the pure-hearted devotee knows that it's love that I'm offering, and this is a vehicle for offering it. There's also another class of devotees, those who are beyond the three gunas, trigunatita. They have the nature of a child. Their worship consists in chanting God's name, just His name. So that's all the worship they feel the need of doing, chanting God's name and being absorbed in the chanting of God's name. That's all that they need to do. As I've said before, I met Bhavatarini, the wife of Upendra, the devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, who had served Sri Ramakrishna. She herself, this woman that I met when she was about 102, she herself had served Sri Ramakrishna and lived with the Holy Mother in Dakshineshwar, in the Nahabat. And Sri Ramakrishna had even arranged her marriage. And so when her husband, who had been desperately poor, he became very wealthy. Sri Ramakrishna had told him that you have a desire for wealth. You are poor now. You go out and make money, then you will come to me. So he did. He went out and he became very wealthy. But then he died. And then her son also died. And so she gave up her wealth and went to Benares and lived in a simple room in a house there for the rest of her life, just doing japa all day. So when I met her, she would spend 8 to 10 hours a day sitting doing japa. So that was her worship, just doing japa. Then to Keshav with a smile, why is it that you are ill? There is a reason for it. Many spiritual feelings have passed through your body, therefore it has fallen ill. At the time an emotion is aroused, one understands very little about it. The blow that it delivers to the body is felt only after a long while. I have seen big steamers going by on the Ganges, at the time hardly noticing their passing. But oh my, what a terrific noise is heard after a while when the waves splash against the banks. Perhaps a piece of the bank breaks loose and falls into the water. An elephant entering a hut creates havoc within and ultimately shakes it down. The elephant of divine emotion enters the hut of this body and shatters it to pieces. So here he's saying that the cause of your illness, Keshav, is that many spiritual emotions have passed through you. Again, through the influence of Sri Ramakrishna and the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, he had become deeply spiritual and spent a great deal of time in spiritual practice and had begun to have spiritual experiences. And so Sri Ramakrishna is saying that at the time of the experience, you don't feel anything. It's like the boat passing through the Ganges. It's only after the boat has passed that the waves in its wake make it to shore and beat against the shore. And so it's after some time that the effect of those experiences comes and that they can shake the body to pieces. Just as an elephant entering into a hut, it breaks the hut to pieces. So the body can be broken by spiritual experience. So many people hearing that, they become afraid. Well, I don't want any spiritual experience if it's going to break my body. They'll know the time will come when you don't care about the body and what happens to the body. You'll know that spiritual experience is such a great value that who cares whether the body lives or dies? I want that. But the reason why people are advised to practice yoga, any of the yogas, and to follow a systematic path of spiritual discipline, to purify their hearts, purify their minds gradually, is so that when spiritual experience comes, the nerves are stronger and are able of containing the experience. But even then, high spiritual experience is going to ravage the body. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, do you know what actually happens? When a house is on fire, at first just a few things inside burn. Then comes the great commotion. Just so the fire of knowledge at first destroys such enemies of spiritual life as passion, anger, and so forth. Then comes the turn of the ego. And lastly, a violent commotion is seen in the physical form. So as we progress on in spiritual life, at first our passions and anger and fear and those things are gradually weakened and then destroyed. Then comes the turn of the ego, and that's a much bigger thing. When the ego is destroyed, then there's considerable commotion. But after that is accomplished, then in time the frame is there's a violent commotion is seen in the physical frame. You may think that everything is going to be over, but God will not release you as long as the slightest trace of your illness is left. And here he's speaking of the illness of worldliness. You simply cannot leave the hospital if your name is registered there. As long as the illness is not perfectly cured, the doctor won't give you a permit to go. Why did you register your name in the hospital at all? All laugh. So, I mean, why did you register your name in the hospital of spiritual perfection? That is, the hospital which cures the disease of worldliness. So why did you register your name there? This is the fruit. This is what's going to happen. Now you can't get out of it. Now your name is registered and you just have to go through the process. Keshav laughed again and again at the master's allusion to the hospital because, again, he understood. So other people hearing this say, well, yeah, better not to register my name. I'll just forget the whole thing. But Keshav understood and laughed again and again at the allusion. Then Sri Ramakrishna spoke of his own illness to Keshav. Hriday, his nephew, used to say, never before have I seen such ecstasy for God, and never before have I seen such illness, meaning in Sri Ramakrishna himself. I was then seriously ill with stubborn diarrhea. It was as if millions of ants were gnawing at my brain. But all the same, spiritual talk went on day and night. Dr. Rama of Natagore was called in to see me. He found me discussing spiritual truth. He said, "What a madman! Nothing is left of him but a few bones, and still he is reasoning like that." But of course, he didn't understand that Sri Ramakrishna's mind was beyond the state of his body. In order to take full advantage, the master to Keshav, all depends on God's will. And then he sings, "O Mother, all is done after thine own sweet will. Thou art in truth self-willed, Redeemer of mankind. Thou workest thine own work, men only call it theirs." So this is a famous song that's Sokoli tomari icha moyema tara tumi, tomar karma tumi koroma, loke bole koriyami. So that's the part of the song which he sang here. In order to take full advantage of the dew, the gardener removes the soil from the basra rose down to the very root. The plant thrives better on account of the moisture. Perhaps that is why you too are being shaken to the very root. Keshav and the master laugh. It may be that you will do tremendous things when you come back. Whenever I hear that you are ill, I become extremely restless. After hearing of your last illness, I used to weep to the Divine Mother in the small hours of the morning. I prayed to her, "O Mother, if anything happens to Keshav, with whom then shall I talk in Calcutta?" Coming to Calcutta, I offered fruits and sweets to the Divine Mother, that is at the Kalighat, with a prayer for your well-being. So here Sri Ramakrishna talks about the gardener exposing the roots of the Basra rose so that the morning dew can fall on them. And by that exposure of the roots, the plant is stimulated to flower. And so he's comparing that to what the Divine Mother is doing to Keshav, that is exposing his roots, causing in him this illness which shakes him to the core, but which will produce great spiritual fruit. And interesting, he says, it may be that you will do tremendous things when you come back. So that normally would be when you come back to health. Perhaps you will do great things when you come back to health. But we know that Keshav didn't come back to health. His disease wasn't cured. He died shortly after this. And so it may be because Sri Ramakrishna could see the past, present, and future of everyone. And certainly he knew that of Keshav. So it may be that when he says, it may be that you will do tremendous things when you come back. That is, when you, perhaps Keshav had another lifetime to come back. And in that lifetime, he will do great things. We won't know him as Keshav and want to know the connection. But Sri Ramakrishna could see that you may be doing great things when you come back. So again, this whole chapter, we'll stop here because it's a good stopping place. But this is a beautiful chapter, and one in which we see both the extraordinary love which Sri Ramakrishna had for Keshav. We see the tremendous transformation which Keshav had undergone, and we see also how Sri Ramakrishna was preparing him for his final departure from the world, creating in him that deep sense of renunciation. Because renunciation, discrimination in the sense of viveka, spiritual discrimination and so forth, had not been part of the Brahmo Samaj at all before Sri Ramakrishna came. Then it gradually entered into the Brahmo Samaj, and now Sri Ramakrishna is encouraging Keshav further in that. And certainly by the time of Keshav's death, through the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, whom Keshav had accepted as a teacher. He never would have said as a guru, because he never got to the point of accepting a guru, but certainly Sri Ramakrishna was his guru in actual fact, whatever Keshav called him. But Keshav, in his last years, not by this time when he was too ill even to leave the house anymore, but when he would see Sri Ramakrishna, he would bow down to him again and again, touch his feet, which was not at all a Brahmo custom. But he had come to respect Sri Ramakrishna, that in the traditional Hindu way, which the Brahmos had rejected, he would bow down and touch Sri Ramakrishna's feet, and then he would say, Joy Navabidhan, Joy Navabidhan, Joy Navabidhan. That is victory to the new dispensation, victory to the new dispensation, victory to the new dispensation, which was what he called his Brahmos, branch of the Brahmo Samaj. And so he was recognizing that Sri Ramakrishna was the new dispensation. He would touch his feet and then say, Jai Navavidhan, recognizing that here is the Navavidhan. This is the new dispensation. And so he certainly had accepted Sri Ramakrishna as his teacher, as his guru, as his ideal, as his model. Whatever it was, whatever the terminology he might have used. So again, in this chapter, we see all of that revealed. So we'll stop here. If there are one or two questions, I'll take those. No questions. Okay, then I'll give announcements and then the closing prayer. Excuse me. So for announcements, on Sunday, I will speak on a Vedantic view of Jesus, and that's in honor of the Christmas season coming. Normally, I would give that talk further into December, but this will be the only Sunday service for December. There'll be very few Sunday services, maybe only one in January. So this Sunday, and then maybe one in January. So for the next 2 months from now, there may be only 2 Sunday services, because the following Sunday I have a retreat on the Advaita Makaranda, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, which those who are interested can register for. So I won't be able to give the talk here on Sunday. The following Sunday, the 12th, I'll be giving it online to the retreat. And then after that comes the next Sunday would be the 19th, and that's so close to Christmas. Everyone is so involved with Christmas preparations. It didn't seem wise to have a Sunday service then. Many of our local people are traveling, and other people are preparing for Christmas, and people are going to see family and so forth. So this Sunday will be the only Sunday service, but we will continue with Tuesday and Thursday classes until about the 16th, I think 15th or 16th. So the next Tuesday, we will have the Mandukya Upanishad instead of the Katha, which we've completed. I had been saying that we would take up the Mundaka Upanishad next, so Mandukya is not a mistake. But because we only have 2 classes in December, and then in January there won't be much of classes, I'll explain why in a moment. So I didn't want to start the Mundaka Upanishad and not get back to it until the end of January or the beginning of February. So we'll take the Mandukya, which is very short. Later, after finishing the other major Upanishads, we'll come back probably and study the Mandukya Upanishad with the Karika of Gaudapada, which is a much longer text in 4 long chapters. But the Mandukya Upanishad itself is the shortest of the major Upanishads. So we'll do that in 2 classes in December. And we'll continue with this class for 3 classes in December. Then we'll have a Christmas Eve service on the 24th of December, which all are invited to. There will be a carol singing, a reading from the Nativity, a short talk I will give on the meaning of Christmas, and there will be Arati also. So everyone is invited to that, December 24th at 7 p.m. There'll be an announcement sent out. And in January, just so that you know why I said that we're not going to have much activities in December or January. In January, I'm going to Bolivia, and I'll be there for 2.5 weeks. And when I come back, we will celebrate Swami Vivekananda's birthday, late January. And so because of that, because of the travel to Bolivia, and then the celebration of Swami Vivekananda's birth. The classes and lectures in January will be few indeed. So now a question has come. Did we have a connection to Sri Thakur in his lifetime? Did we have a connection to Sri Thakur in his lifetime? It's possible. Some people living today may have had a connection to Thakur, but that we don't know. And maybe if we go high enough in the spiritual life, we will see past connections. But that there's no way of telling that other than that. But let me say that Mathur Babu, who was so close to Sri Ramakrishna, who served him so devotedly, Sri Ramakrishna, people asked later, long after Mathur had passed away, many years after he had passed away, when the young disciples were coming to Sri Ramakrishna, they asked him, when Sri Ramakrishna was talking about Mathur and his great service, they asked him, what became of Mathur? Did he attain to illumination? So Sri Ramakrishna said he had a few desires left, and so perhaps he has been reborn as a king somewhere. That's all he said, and he would refuse to answer other questions. And so it was believed by Swamis in the order, much earlier in the order, that the Raja of Mysore had been Mathur in a previous life, because Sri Ramakrishna said he had some desires left, so perhaps he has been reborn as a king. That's a very old idea in India, which Swami Vivekananda also mentions approvingly, that a great spiritual aspirant, if they still have some desires left, they take birth as a king or great ruler, and in order to fulfill their desires, and then in the next life they complete their spiritual journey, because until one has fulfilled all desires, one can't come to the end of spiritual evolution. And so a great spiritual person who had gone far on the path but couldn't get rid of all desires, they have to come back. So because the Raja of Mysore was so devoted to the Ramakrishna order and did so many things for the order and for the monks of the order, for its work and so forth, and because he was unusually spiritually minded and unselfish, unusual for a king especially, people thought that, well, if Mathur came back as a king, perhaps he came back in this form and has been of such great service to the Ramakrishna mission. So that we don't know also. That's a devout intuition. So that's... What was the new dispensation? Catholicity of religions? Okay, there's another question here. What was the new dispensation that Keshav started? So yes, it was the Catholicity. It included the Catholicity, which they learned from Sri Ramakrishna. It included the idea that God can be realized, the idea that spiritual practice can be done, the idea of God as mother. All of these things were absent in the Brahmo Samaj prior to Sri Ramakrishna's meeting with Keshav. So all of these Keshav presented as the Navavidhan, the new dispensation. And Keshav himself began to believe that the great founders of other religions, all of them were great souls, and that they continued to exist in the subtle realm, in the spiritual realm, that Buddha, Jesus, and other great spiritual heroes continued to exist and continued to answer the prayers of those who approached them. And so he began to meditate on the figures like Buddha and Jesus and other great spiritual figures. So with that, I'll close with a closing prayer. More questions? Oh, down below. A retreat on what? Oh, the retreat on Advaita Makaranda. It's a text on non-dualism. You can find out by going to our website. There on the events page, there's a link. And also, if you get our email, you would have gotten an email with the link to the retreat. So it's a text on non-dualism, on the path of knowledge. So Holy Mother's birthday and Kalpataru Day. Yes, I was asked to mention that. That's so far away, but on January 1st, we'll have Kalpataru Day and Holy Mother's birthday. But I intentionally didn't mention that because otherwise you get so many announcements that nobody keeps anything in mind. So let's wait for those things. So let me give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Voye Ishavatanam Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all.